Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you're all joined. It's actually good afternoon now, isn't it? It's 12 o'clock. So welcome here to a field of cover crop, courtesy of Richard Bramley, just outside Selby. On this actually fine autumnal afternoon, we've got quite a good crop here, as you can see. Lots of flowers. We're very fortunate here to have a team of guys here. We have Richard Emmett from Yorkshire Water. Andrew Walker also from Yorkshire Water. We have David George, Director of Farms at Newcastle University, who is a very well-renowned entomologist. So he'll be looking at some of the insects that we have available today and some of the other creatures that this cover crop has attracted and fed and given a habitat to. And we also have Richard Bramley, who is the farmer. So he's going to talk a little bit about the project that he's involved with, and he is head of sustainability as well for the NFU. So he is going to talk a little bit about some of that. So thank you very much. We've got hopefully everybody's now through on the live feed. We at Future Food Solutions have been working with Yorkshire Water for nearly 5 years now, and we, having had meetings with Andrew Walker, we came up with the idea of the sustainable landscapes, which is looking to develop more sustainable farming systems over a given geography. Now, we've done stuff historically with brands and developed sort of vertical collaboration with the brands down to farms. So very much looking at farmers that were supplying sort of barley or sugar beet or wheat into particular brands. But the landscapes was different because Yorkshire Water had particular issues. At the time, it was actually metaldehyde, with very specific sort of key areas in where they abstract water. And we, talking to Andrew, we believed that we could actually work with a group of farmers in a particular geography to actually come to terms and manage some of the issues, and actually hopefully, farm in a different sort of way, change the culture of how they farm and the techniques they use for the benefit to improve soil fertility, to make their crops more resilient and hopefully improve their yields and the consistency of yields. But at the same time, if we can improve soil quality, then we can also improve water quality.
Thanks very much. As you can imagine, the challenge of broadcasting live from a field of cover crops just outside Selby is even bigger than it is managing Zoom calls from your office or your home office. But I think Paul summarised the project really, really well as far as we're concerned. It's a great collaboration between Yorkshire Water, Future Food Solutions and farmers. This particular project here is part of our Elvington pilot, where we've worked with three areas across the Derwent catchment, including Elvington and one up at Thirsk as well. And from our perspective, it makes complete sense to work in this way. Why would you end up having to pay money to take silt out of water to treatment works when you can tackle the problem better upstream here in the field? Why would you pay money to remove nitrates, phosphates and other nutrients from the soil, also at treatment works, to maintain the ecosystem in the river, when you can deal with that issue much better up in the farmer's field? And if that works in favour of the farmer as well, because they get more bangs for their buck from their nutrient loading, then why would that not make sense for all parties? So as far as Yorkshire Water is concerned, we view this as taking the first stage of water treatment away from the treatment works and up into the field. And that makes complete sense to us. And it's a brilliant way of collaborating with farmers. And the other advantage, particularly in flood vulnerable catchments, is that if you plant cover crops, it improves the water retention within the soil by a significant degree. And that helps us in terms of flood mitigation downstream as well. So that's the background to this sort of project from a Yorkshire Water perspective. Shall I bring in at this point?
Yeah, bring in Andrew.
Yeah, let me bring in Andrew, because Andrew's been has run these projects for a long time for Yorkshire Water and has been a real innovator in this area. So, Andrew, do you want to tell us a little bit how it all started, and maybe just amplify some of the points I've made on water quality and flood retention?
Sure.
Thank you.
we set out a number of years ago with catchment management, focusing primarily on the uplands and trying to understand why colour in the raw water was getting worse. We came to the conclusion that there was a very strong correlation between how you manage the moorland habitat and the impact that that has on peat. Historically, there's been quite a challenge between the moorland community and regulators over what's been happening. And we were fortunate in a way to be involved in that discussion, might be probably the best word, on how you manage landscape. So we did something in collaboration with all of the moorland community and the regulators, something we call Bogathon, which some of you may have heard of, but basically that was all of the stakeholders going out asking what each of us needed from this landscape. And it was quite clear that at the end of the 3 days, consistently, the only habitat that routinely delivered biodiversity, water quality, carbon, grouse and sheep was a healthy active blanket bog with a lot less heather and a lot more sphagnum. The landscape was telling us that, the land managers were telling us that, gamekeepers were telling us that. So that collaborative approach actually led to the government's first blanket bog restoration strategy. So as the second largest landowner in Yorkshire, there are things that we could do on our own estate. But for me, the prize was trying to influence all of the English uplands, which we managed to do. And that approach is very much something I wanted to try and replicate in the lowlands and say, could we take an outcomes-based approach to lowland farming and have something like an agri-fund, for example, different outcomes and different stakeholders. That never really took off, which is a shame, but we got introduced to Future Food Solutions, as Paul said, well, 5-6 years ago, and we sat down and worked out what can we actually do to make a difference to farming in Yorkshire. Richard's covered some of the topics, some of the issues that we had to deal with, but I think what we have identified through this programme of work is a range of outcomes that lowland arable soils can deliver. So clearly we need improved water quality. We need to keep the sediment in the field and not in the rivers. We need to make sure that farming is profitable and resilient and mitigate the impacts of a changing climate. And I think perhaps the icing on the cake for me, and certainly something that is developing through the programme, is the carbon opportunities that we see from growing cover crops. So cover crops are a range of different types of crop that you can grow in between a cash crop. So it's not an either or. You can grow your winter wheat and have a cover crop before that. So, you know, in sort of up to 12 weeks, some of the cover crops that we've been growing through this programme and other programmes that Future Food Solutions are involved with, we're getting up to 80 tonnes of above ground biomass within a 12-week period, which is enormous. And that equates to maybe 6 to 8 tonnes of carbon being stored within the soil profile. So that carbon is staying in the soil, and it's helping to build the organic matter that we've lost over decades of farming with chemicals and horsepower rather than trying to farm with biology and nature. So there is a real opportunity to utilise and optimise the amount of carbon that we can build into the soil, because it's going to benefit the farmer. We're looking at the potential for trading carbon through the carbon bank that's in its infancy at the moment. But I am pleased to say that the Future Food Solutions team, with our input, have been selected as finalists for the world's first Climate Challenge Cup, and that's going to be announced at COP26 next week. So unfortunately I can't go, but that's probably not a bad thing. So what we've seen with these cover crops is their ability to open up soil structure as well as bring carbon into it. So probably after the war, when we started really ramping up farming production methods, we basically have lost a huge amount of carbon and organic matter from our soils. And a lot of modern arable crops are a little more, the soil is little more than a substrate for the chemicals that you chuck at it. They've got very, very shallow root structures. And as a consequence, there's a lot of compaction in the soils. They're unable to absorb, retain and attenuate water. The water just falls on the landscape and runs straight off again. So we need to find a way of getting the functionality of the soils back, and cover crops are an exceptionally good way of doing that. So you've got the phacelias and the oats with sort of shallowish root masses, but very fibrous root masses. And the exudates that come from those really encourage the microbial activity within the soil. And that microbial activity then frees up other functions biological functions within the soil profile. Some of the oilseed radishes that we've got, they're almost like bunker busters. They've got really, really, really strong tap roots that go down sort of 3 or 4 feet and really open up the soil profile. And that then gives the worms. Hopefully today we will see Colin, possibly his younger brother Brian the worm, as we do through. But worms are absolutely fantastic for doing the work for us. So, you know, why waste time with diesel and wearing steel out when Colin and Brian will do the job for you? So we've got the 3 pilot areas. At first, Shipton and here with Richard at the Elbington pilot. Since then, we launched the Sustainable Landscapes Humber project. We did that with Bird's Eye last year. And the idea there was to challenge in a constructive way as to whether peas could be grown in a more sustainable way. Traditionally with peas, you would harvest your wheat, for example, in the autumn, and then you would plough it and you'd leave that field fallow over winter. That leaves it very vulnerable to erosion and nutrient loss. And some of the figures that we're getting when you plant a cover crop after the peas have been harvested, they can scavenge up to 400 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. That would either have gone up or down. And so clearly, I mean, the price of fertilizer at the moment is between £600 and £700 a tonne. So if you can actually hold up to 400 kilograms, you're saving yourself 200 kilograms per hectare. So that's really moving ahead within the Humber catchment. We've linked up with the Living with Water partnership because we believe that there's a huge amount of money going into infrastructure within Hull itself, blue-green channel infrastructure, and trying to understand how the various assets work. But we think, I think we're sure that we can actually use the River Hull catchment itself, the land within the catchment, to help store and mitigate flooding within Hull itself. So for every 1% increase in soil organic carbon, you can increase the water holding capacity by an additional 200 tonnes per hectare. So when you're looking at 500,000 hectares of arable land in Yorkshire, hopefully you can do your maths yourself. I can't on the top of my head, but it is enormous. And what we found throughout of this programme is if we all play fair, everybody wins. We're all getting a benefit from it. The farmer gets a benefit, the supply chain get a benefit in terms of a reduced carbon, potentially carbon negative raw material, which helps with their net zero commitments, and society benefits in terms of mitigating flooding. But when we see, when we nip over to David George and start to look at the invertebrates and just the sheer biology that goes on with these cover crops, it's absolutely phenomenal. We did one, I think, last year, and you could actually hear the field before you could see it. There were so many bees buzzing around there. So we have lost a lot of insect populations over the years. And I think this is a fantastic way to get them back. I do have a secret yearning to have a sustainable landscapes honey dotted around, so we are working with that. So the last programme that we've launched this year is up on the Wolds, up near Kilham, and that's trying to understand how we can use nitrogen more efficiently. So the averaging nitrogen use efficiency is around 40%. We know from trials that have been undertaken within Yorkshire, you can get that up to 87%. So that is a real cost saving for the farmer, and it's a real reduction in the amount of nitrogen that's going down into our aquifers. So the whole Sustainable Landscapes programme, I think, is drawing attention from other water companies, which is great. You know, if we can share some of the learning here. We have been working with the Baker Institute in Texas to develop what we think is the world's first certified soil organic carbon credit, which could be a game changer when it comes to how we recognise what agriculture can deliver. And it's not just food, it's all of those other ecosystem services benefits. So if we can add biodiversity benefits onto that, so managing field margins in a slightly different way, then farmers could be rewarded for improving and maintaining a real diverse farm margin. I think it's time for me to close. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That's a really, really good sort of synopsis of what we're trying to achieve. And as I say, Andrew's been really pivotal in working with us to make that happen. If you could sort of follow me now in a sort of television style mode. Here we have Richard Bramley. Richard Bramley farms this field. He drilled this rather excellent cover crop. And I think it's down to Richard to talk a little bit about the cover crop, his farming system, why he's involved, and what he's hoping to achieve. Richard.
Yes, thank you very much for that, Paul. And you know, we're blessed with a lovely day. And I think the first thing I think everybody would have to agree, isn't it an absolute picture? This, I mean, it's just so good for the soul. It's not just good for everything else that you've heard about so far, but it just feels really right. And I began looking at cover crops back in 2007. That's where my interest began, and it was looking at how I could enhance biodiversity alongside not losing sight of that critical need for production, because we've got to be extremely careful that we maintain and improve our production with ever less impact, whilst at the same time improving biodiversity. And so I started about by doing single species and trying different things out. I had a few trial areas where we had strips, and as we've heard, that peer-to-peer learning was a key part of that. So we would host farmers on site, and we just have a look and see what was happening. But over time, we began to see that there was further benefits that we could get from this. It was not only addressing biodiversity from the point of view of the small birds and the mammals, but then we had the nectar, the late flowering habitat that was being created. You then start to think about the impact it's having on the soil and the soil improvement that you've heard about already, the building up of organic matter. That's then linked very nicely into carbon and water quality, which is where Yorkshire Water have come in as well. So it's been really good to get that chain of understanding from the farm, from the land and the activity of farming right the way through. So what we've done here is we've got a mixture of 6 different species. They're following a crop of winter malting barley, and this will be going into a crop of potatoes next spring. So these were sown around about the 7th of August. They'll be in the ground. This will be green until into March. What we probably do, the first thing that we do is we would flail a crop of this height. That keeps the root alive. It doesn't completely kill the plant, but it allows some of the matter to start to break down. But we've got a radish here. You can see it's starting to pod up. We've got Phacelia with its interesting, almost prawn-like flowers. We've got this one. This is an interesting one. They don't tend to last very long, but this is a buckwheat. What I really like about buckwheat is that within 5 weeks of sowing, this is producing flowers. So it's in September, it's addressing nectar need. And also it produces seeds. Now, I've never had an issue with these growing in following crops, but there's also a food source as well for birds. So you've got twin benefits there. They don't produce a huge amount of biomass, but that's what the other plants are there for. We've then got this one here. This is a vetch here. They often produce purple flowers, and there are clovers as well, which inevitably there's an oat. That's another thing that's sown in there. If you look down in the base, you can actually probably see some of the volunteer barley as well. So they've all got different rooting, and they're all doing different things. And if I just have a dig in, and I'm not making any promises because I didn't know that Colin and Brian were due to make an appearance, but if we have a look at the soil here, see the wonderful texture. And something I've learned through this project is that the smell of good soil actually lowers the heart rate. That's how connected we are with our soil and our natural environment. You see all the different roots through there.
Just bring that into the light for us. There we go.
All the roots there, that lovely crumbliness. A lot of that is formed from the exudates that Andrew mentioned from the roots and their interaction. They can account for a huge amount of carbon. No worms as of yet. There's one. We found him. Found him, Andrew. Yeah. I don't know. You know them better than I do.
Which one is it? Oh, that's Brian.
But that will help keep the land in really good condition right the way through winter. It provides cover. I walk the dog here, and we see endless birds. I'll be supplementary feeding them, and you'll see them flitting out and in and out of the crop, feeding, getting cover, and it just all works really well together.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. That is, oh God, there's a hole there. that's really good. I mean, we coined the term pop-up rainforest because like a rainforest, we have various tiers of plants. So you've got the tall trees, or these, in this case, the radishes. Then we have the sort of the medium growing Phacelia. And then in the bottom, we have the clovers and some of the sort of oats and things like that. So that combination of different plants have very complementary leaf structures. And that means we absolutely maximize the amount of sunlight that it can take in. And that maximizes the amount of photosynthesis and optimizes the amount of carbon drawdown. So these crops grow incredibly quickly. They also grow very quickly at a time of year when temperatures are starting to fall, and also day length's starting to get shorter. So they're quite a unique set of plants, really, because most plants are sort of thinking of shutting down in that sort of early autumn, late summer, as these plants are just getting going. And I think that's the really exciting thing. And yes, some of these will get taken out by frost. Some of the other ones, some of the cereals, sort of like the winter oats, or we would probably use grazing rye, they'll just keep growing. They'll keep photosynthesizing even down to sort of 3-4 degrees. So they're, and by having that sort of mix of plants, it means that we optimize the benefit of those cover crops. Also, as sort of Richard has shown, the sort of radishes have a sort of, I've just chopped his root off, but a long and deep root, whereas the Phacelia has a sort of more sort of gangly lateral roots. And then the oats, they have a sort of fibrous root at the surface. So again, you're sort of maximizing the various sort of different roots and filling all those sort of soil spaces. And with having lots of different plants in there, it's stimulating different types of microbes and different types of fungi and things like that. So in some respects, you're getting like many years of rotation. We use rotations in farming to freshen up the soil and generate sort of different sort of microbes and fungi. And the cover crop will do this in a really short time, and it'll do that on a very broad basis. And so, you know, historically, we've always thought of soil as sort of sand, silt, and clay. Soil is so much more complicated than that. It's a rich biosystem, almost like a rainforest in its own right, with lots of things going on. And the interactions between the microbes, the interactions with the fungi, and the relationship between those soil organisms and the plant roots are really, really important. And as we learn more, and we start to understand more, we can use that to the benefit of farming and to the benefit of the environment. And these plants are putting at least a third of the carbohydrates that they photosynthesize into the soil itself as a sugary exudate, and that supercharges the whole soil. So that what's happening below the soil. We're very fortunate here today to have with us David George. David George is a director of farms for Newcastle University, and David, I guess, he loves chasing bugs around.
I certainly do, yes.
And he's been quite busy this morning. So even though we're into November now, when you'd think it's all going to be a bit quiet here and everything's run for cover, actually this field is still pretty busy, and you've been catching all sorts of things, haven't you, David?
Yes, yeah. Even though it is November, it looks quite sunny here, but it's still quite cold, and it's not the ideal time of year to be out looking for certainly anything like bees. As you can see, we've got a huge area here of floral resource, and typically there are fields that I've driven past on the way down from Newcastle. There are fields that I can see here at the moment that are bare. They don't have any of that resource for insects that are still active at this time of year, that will need things like pollen, that may need nectar, which I'll have here in abundance with the Phacelia still in flower. It will continue to flower for a while yet. And we've also got all of the green cover, the structure that Paul's just mentioned as well, to provide that shelter. And it's great for me coming down from Newcastle to see this on this scale. A lot of the sort of work I do as an academic researcher is typically in smaller plots. So looking at this living lab on this scale is fantastic. And you can just imagine, I'll have a little sweep around here. I'll show you what I'll be able to catch, but you have to imagine almost that scaled up across this entire field, and of course potentially across the landscapes that the guys are working on. So bear with me, I'll have a quick bash around with my sweep net, which I carry everywhere.
So while David Attenborough is having a little go around here, one of the things that, you know, this cover crop is great at sequestrating carbon. Some of the clovers in there will sequestrate nitrogen, but probably more importantly, their roots will actually scavenge whatever nutrients are left post the crop. And that's really important because they lock that up and prevent that leaching into farms and into waterways. So they're really important. So Dave, what you caught, mate?
Let's have a look. Hopefully you'll be able to get a reasonably good look at this. Where's the sun?
Bring into the light for a minute.
Yeah, where can I stand? If I stand that
go.
way, there we go. So there goes a fly. Flies are notoriously hard to identify all the way down to the species, so I'll just call those all flies. But certainly, if we have a look in there, there's a bit of plant material in that I'll try and move out, but hopefully you can see in there that is absolutely alive with various creepy crawlies. And just from here, I can see that there's a number of different species of fly. There's some bugs in there. We've got wasps. So this is a parasitoid wasp. Fantastic. That's a parasitoid wasp. They look quite similar to flies and very different to your typical wasp. But these guys are absolutely fantastic at providing the sort of function, the ecosystem service of biological control. You can see they're all over, flies and wasps all over this piece of Phacelia here. And more or less everything that's in here, even if it's something like a parasitoid wasp, that will prey upon an aphid, it will have at some stage in its life a requirement to feed on floral resources. And as well as the flowers that you can see in this field at the moment, quite a lot of the floral species that we have in here will also provide something called extra floral nectar, which is highly available for some of these very small insects like parasitoids. I just grab a handful. You can probably see all the things that are now flying off my hand and crawling up it. There's a spider, a few more wasps, lots of little flies. And I'm an entomologist, so it's these guys that really excite me. But as you can imagine, this is part of a food web, part of an ecological network. And a lot of what's in here will be providing food for things like farmland birds as well, and going sort of higher up the food chain. You might be looking at, again, moving up from insects, might be looking at all the small mammals that might be in here too. So even on a relatively cold day in November, this is absolutely teeming with life. And again, if we were to have a really good dig around below the soil, we'd find that just as much life below as we would above. And really, it's a resource that wouldn't be here otherwise, and we wouldn't be able to support these insects in this environment without this cover crop growing. But I think probably, as has already been captured by other speakers this afternoon, the benefits to biodiversity are just one of the benefits of having a good, diverse cover crop mixture on the field at this time of year. And I think it's one of the things that I like most about them, and probably one of the things that I tend to work on most and that gets me up in the morning, is looking at solutions like this, which, as we need to transition our agricultural systems, can be hard working solutions for the farmer, providing multiple benefits from this single cover crop mix that's been put over this field. And again, I don't know how well you can see this through the camera, but just by chance, the flower head that I'm holding here is absolutely covered in spiders' webs, and I can actually see quite a lot of those as the sun's glinting off them on this lovely Yorkshire afternoon, scattered through the field.
David, I mean, this is there's an absolute, loads going on here. It's very exciting.
Yes.
One of the things we've been looking at and talking at, so this cover crop's great, and we're looking for the farmers that we're working with is to get these in wherever they can. Now, whether that's sort of as a catch crop, which is, quite a short, maybe 60, 80-day period in between, a winter barley followed by maybe another winter crop, or as this one is, which is a more longer term cover crop. But one of the real opportunities may be to look at what we're describing as a functional field margin. So look at the sort of area around the fields, which are there, and many farms have buffer zones, particularly around rivers. Many farmers in country stewardship have, and actually make more of those. David, you've done some work on that, haven't you?
I have, yes, but it was almost as I became an entomologist many years ago. One of the first projects that I worked on was DEFRA funded. It was one of the old Fortlink model of projects, and we were looking at how we could develop field margin seed mixes to provide more than just the conservation benefits, if you like. So traditionally, those field margin seed mixes may have been developed with farmland birds or with pollinators in mind, bees and butterflies perhaps. But we were really wanting to have a look to see if, just by making a few simple tweaks to the seed mix itself, if we could build in benefits for biological control on top of those for pollination and conservation. And the reason we need to make those tweaks, and we want to stack those benefits up, is because different types of insects require different types of flowers, for example. So if you are a parasitoid wasp, you have very different mouth parts to something like a bumblebee, and you need a different type of flower to feed upon. You might also need, at certain times of year, alternative hosts. If I'm a parasitoid wasp and I need to lay eggs inside an aphid, much like the film Alien, which will then hatch out like a horror film, I can only lay my eggs in the crop when there are aphids in the crop. So actually, we almost require the aphids to be in the crop before the parasitoids come in. But if you can provide resources around fields in field margins that tick the boxes for the parasitoid wasp, so it could be another species of aphid, for example, that it will use as a host, but that won't threaten the crop itself, you can make sure that those beneficial insects are there in the field year round and are therefore able to potentially respond more quickly when pests do move into the crop environment. So yeah, lots of interest and lots of the work I've done in the past looking at how we can make those margins work harder for the farmer.
Good afternoon. I'm here in a field just outside Selby with the farmer Richard Bramley, a cracking crop of cover crop here that he's planted post-harvest. Richard, tell me about this crop and why you've done this.
Yeah, so the crop was sown around about the 7th of August, and in essence for me it began as how can I improve biodiversity and at least maintain production. So this follows winter barley. It'll be going in with potatoes in the spring. I've been doing this for quite a lot of years, and I started off with single species, then started to learn that there was actually a lot of benefits to different species. started mixing them together, and we've ended up with this mix of 6 different types of plants. They all do something different, but in essence what they're all doing is they are providing wonderful cover. They're providing some late nectar with the flowers, and there's 3 to 4 of them which will flower, and they'll flower in sequence, so we're getting some early and some later, and some that will survive even a few frosts just in case we get some late sunny days. They've all got different rooting systems, so they've all got a slightly different interaction. Some of them are shallow rooting, some of them are deep rooting. They'll all interact slightly differently with the soil biology, which is something which we've very much learnt about in recent years, is really critical to soil health. They're all trapping nutrients as well. So what I don't want to do is I don't want to see nutrients go down the drain. That's valuable to me, and it's valuable as long as it's kept out of water. So these things are also critically important. So alongside of all those benefits, I'm also doing what plants do better than anything else, which is to trap carbon from the atmosphere. And as we're seeing currently with the COP26 discussions and the real pressure that the planet's coming under from climate change, plants really are the solution here. And if we can capture more and more carbon than we would do normally, get it into the soil, get it safe in there, we're improving the organic matter, which is great for water retention. That improves our resilience. So we're not only help mitigating climate change, we're helping adapt to it as well. So multiple benefits. Put this across a big field like this, fantastic. Put it on so many fields across the whole country, you've got a real winner.
So I'm Dave George, I work at Newcastle University. I've got a role up there as Director of Farms Research, so I look after some of the links between the work that we do on our Newcastle University farms and some of the research that we do in our city centre. A lot of that research and a lot of our academics up there, a lot of our researchers are working on topics like how we can encourage more biodiversity into the landscape. And because of the sheer areas of land that agriculture covers, we have a lot of researchers that are interested in looking at how agriculture can play a beneficial role in promoting biodiversity as we move forward with the future of food systems. And as you'll probably know, we are living in a time at the moment of biodiversity decline, not just insects, but also things like birds as well. And over recent years, where we've tracked numbers, things like farmland birds have performed particularly poorly as compared to things like seabirds, for example. Whilst there's a challenge there, there's also a huge opportunity, again, because of those areas that are covered by agricultural land. If we can start to do things like this, like introduce these large swathes of flowering fields throughout the country in sort of between growing crops, we have a real opportunity to support some of that biodiversity with the resources that we can provide. And I think especially if we can find ways to support farmers to do that and to do it well, we can start to hopefully address some of those declines that we're seeing in things like bees and butterflies, for example. Lots of that biodiversity can also play potentially beneficial roles on farm. So everybody, for example, will know that bees are pollinating insects. So if you're growing a crop that requires pollination, you'd want bees there to help promote yield and crop quality. But also quite a lot of insects will perform roles such as aerating the soil, earthworms being a fantastic example, decomposing organic matter, building carbon within the soil. And above the ground, you might have things like ladybirds, for instance, that are extremely good generalist predators. So if you have a crop and you have a pest outbreak of something like an aphid, if you've got lots of ladybirds in there munching away on those aphids, it may mean that you don't have to rely as heavily on inputs like synthetic pesticides, for example. And we call that biological control. Lots of those biological control organisms will benefit from something like this cover that this cover crop is providing. It will provide a floral resource for them. So for things like parasitoid wasps and hoverflies, they will require flower feeding at certain stages of their life cycle in order to reproduce and have the energy to go and hunt down those aphids before they or their offspring then feed upon them. It also provides a really good structure. So looking throughout this cover crop today, we've seen lots of spiders. There are sort of bits of silk and spiders webs in amongst a lot of the flower heads that you can see in front of me, and scattered throughout the field. And again, a really good generalist predator, and if we can encourage huge numbers of those across this field, that's a great resource to have for the farmer in terms of helping to manage pest numbers. We've also got, as we look down the cover crop, we've got certain flowers in here, things like this Phacelia, that will flower quite late into the year. So for a lot of insects, and particularly with challenges around climate, that might be knocking some of their life cycles a bit, or interfering with when they would perhaps normally go into to sort of sleep for the winter. Having a late flowering resource like this can be extremely valuable for providing the energy that those sorts of insects need to stock up for that winter period, when they'll be sort of hibernating or sleeping torpor, sleeping over the winter. But it's not just the flowers on some of these plants that are important. Some of them, if I can find an example, so we've got things like buckwheat in here, although the buckwheat has flowered very quickly since this cover crop was sown and has now stopped flowering, but then is providing a good seed resource for birds. But buckwheat and also vetch, which I've seen scattered throughout this cover crop, are both well known to provide extra floral nectar as well. And if you've got a flower like buckwheat, it's not necessarily the case that every insect that you want to encourage can feed upon that type of flower, or this type of flower, for example. So having a diversity of flowers is really good, but also having plants within a cover crop mix that can provide extra floral nectar, which is nectar that's not produced in the flowers, but is produced from leaf nodes, for example, which is then very accessible to a huge range of insects, is also very beneficial to encouraging biodiversity. There's a really nice example of a Phacelia flower just in front of me here, shining in the sun, and that one's yet to fully flower, and they will carry on for at least a month or so yet, providing this floral resource. And in fact, there are probably insects in that flower head. So even though we're here very late in the year, really, had we been here in June, July or August, and we had anything like a flowering crop or a flowering field margin, we would have seen lots of things like bees buzzing around. We haven't seen as many of those today, although there have been a few bumblebees, and those are probably next year's queens that are now stocking up on energy, feeding from flowers, preparing themselves for the winter. And of course, it's a time of year when there might not be much of that resource around in the landscape for them. So having it here, providing that benefit to our insects, whilst also providing all of those other benefits that can be gained from a cover crop, such as protection of the soil surface from any heavy rain. Fortunately, we haven't got any today, but I'm sure we will have as we get later on into November. Building soil health through all of the root architecture that we have below my feet, providing all of that shelter and all of that habitat. It ticks an awful lot of boxes. So this is the first time I've ever been to this field. I've known Richard and I've known the guys at Future Food Solutions and the work they're doing with Yorkshire Water for many years. But just having a look around this field today, one of the things I've noticed is just how easily my spade goes into the soil. So if you pan down to my spade here, and it just sinks straight through with next to no effort whatsoever. But at the same time, with all of this cover crop material that you can see on the soil surface, I don't need to wear a pair of wellies to come into this field. I have wellies in the back of my car, but I just don't need them. I'm not taking a load of soil sticking to my shoes. And one of the advantages of cover cropping that we probably haven't touched on too much is the potential that it has to manage things like soil moisture. So that you've actually got and particularly important when we have very unpredictable weather at the moment. But with all of that root architecture that we have below the surface, if we do get lots of rain on this field, it's not sitting around, it's being sucked up like a sponge into all of this green material from the plants and sort of locked up in that way, along with all of that nitrogen, of course. And this cover crop hasn't had a drop of fertiliser applied to it. So everything that you can see that's green has been driven by any nitrogen that was left in the soil. And what will happen going into next year as the next crop goes in, that nitrogen will be slowly released through all of this green material as organic matter once it's put back into the soil ahead of that crop. Cool.
Well, thanks for your attention today. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. I found it absolutely fascinating, and thank you to Richard Bramley for hosting us here over near Rickall. I'd like to extend my thanks and gratitude for all of the farmers that are involved with the Sustainable Landscapes programme. We literally couldn't do it without you, so thank you very much.